The coming of the English and the Boer War was a great tragedy that affected not only the Boers, but even the black people. They both suffered materially, spiritually, and otherwise. And the scars of that suffering are still there on both sides.
By 1902, after 2 years of fighting, 250,000 British troops were finally gaining the upper hand over 20,000 Boers. The dying months of the war were the cruelest. Capture, death and desertion had whittled down Boer numbers. But the whole empire had answered Britain's call.
Australia sent over 16,000, and they were all volunteers. New Zealand sent 6,500 men, the same number of horses, which were some of the best horses in the country, and a fair number of field pieces. Canada had nearly 8,000 volunteers here. So you got these huge numbers of colonial volunteers fighting on the British side and distinguishing themselves very much so. Sometimes I think very much to the discomfort of the British generals. Difficult people, those Australians.
This was less a war of pitched battles than of isolated guerrilla skirmishes. One task was to clear the veldt of civilians, to cut off support for the Boers. Walker Thompson of the Bushmen's Corps wrote to his brother about the scorched earth policy.
We burned hundreds of homes and had to turn the women and children out. It's a job I can't stand. We came over to fight men, not women and children.
Colonial troops were often used at the hard margins of the war, on the toughest terrain against die-hard Boer commandos. They earned a reputation for ruthlessness. The Bushveld Carbineers was an irregular outfit of Australians, loyal South Africans, British and others, raised to mop up in the wilds of the northern Transvaal. Several Carbineers were court-martialed for shooting dead 8 Boers after they had surrendered. Their defence was they had orders to take no prisoners. 2 Australian officers, Lieutenants Breaker Morant and Handcock, were shot by firing squad for a practice that some got away with, as Walker Thompson witnessed.
The Munster Fusiliers thought it'd be easier to mind corpses than live men, so they bayoneted about 30 of the Boers and lay down and had a good sleep.
The Boers, too, increasingly committed atrocities against blacks fighting for the British. Boer General Marnie Moritz and his men operated behind the lines in the British Cape Colony. In January 1902, they reached the settlement of Lelyfontein. The story has passed down the generations.
This was a rich area. It had food, it had grain, it had sheep, it had cattle, and it had horses. My child, the Boers came, and they destroyed everything. They bankrupted everyone, and they planted poverty in our soil.
The people of Lelyfontein were fiercely loyal to Britain. They served as scouts and spies, but Mani Maritz wasn't having any of it.
Het my pa na hulle toe gegaan en vir hulle gesê, kyk, hierdie storie wat julle die Engelse help.
My father said to them, this business of you supporting the English, we don't want it. We won't bother you, but we don't want you coming out with all that shit here. We're giving you a proclamation which will tell you the terms under which you may live here. And he read it aloud to them. And when he got to the point where it said, I do not want to find you in this war fighting for the Queen of England, Barnabas Link said, you bastard, don't you speak that way about my queen. And he hit my father over the head with a knob carrier.
It was with a knob kiri like this that he hit Maritz, and that blow cost all the trouble right there and then. As Maritz came down in front of the church, Barney Lengs hit him with a stick. And then vengeance came into the war.
Die storie is dat generaal Maritz kon met hierdie ding skiet.
They used to say that General Maritz could use this as well as any cowboy used his gun. If you look at it, you can see that it had a range of 1,000 meters. It was an unusual revolver in that you could add this on and then you'd shoot with it butted up against your shoulder. This is the weapon he fought with at Lelyfontein. That day, they shot and killed 8 colored people.
The Boers then retreated through this pass, where they were ambushed by the people of Lelyfontein, who rolled boulders down onto them, killing 30 Boers.
The next day, he went back with his men in an organized commando to take his revenge, because they could have killed him.
Maritz and his men wiped out Lelyfontein, strewing bodies across the church garden. 46 killed and 100 wounded. The survivors shackled as slaves or scattered in terror.
The women folk had to bury those who were shot. My child, it was a sad story our old people told us.
Boers like Maritz were determined that nothing must threaten white supremacy in South Africa. But the people of Lelyfontein had no compunction about taking on the Boers. They, like many other non-whites in South Africa, were active players in this war. Across the country there was considerable variation in allegiance. Most Basutos sided with Britain, but some believed their best hopes lay with the Boers and weren't afraid to strike out on their own.
The Basutos said the English were good people, not like the Boers. My grandfather disagreed. He said a Boer will do exactly what he says. When he says, I'll pay you, he really means it. When he says, I'll thrash you, he means that as well. He gives you a good beating. You know where you are with the Boers. People started hating my grandfather because he continued to like them.
The Boers always needed fresh supplies. They increasingly relied on sympathetic blacks, like Etienne Mafutsenyana's grandfather.
He had a house not far from here. During the night, he flew a flag at his house so the Boers wouldn't get lost. He would hide them in his house while he went to Basutoland to buy clothes for them. Then they would leave and others would come and he would do the same all over again.
The British also torched black homes to deny support to the Boers. Will Saxon of the Manchester Regiment wrote home about these operations.
As far as I could see in every direction, kraals were burning. I feel sorry for the black women. The tears roll down their cheeks and the piccaninnies cluster round them. I always think of a wounded stag when I see them, staring at their burning huts.
The British herded over 120,000 blacks into a network of 75 concentration camps. Little known about during the war, the black camps have been all but forgotten since. They initially seemed like sanctuary after the dangers of living on the veldt. Anna Mollekeng has never forgotten her first sight of the Scottish soldiers.
They weren't wearing ordinary clothes. They were wearing red skirts. They had fringed belts across their chests. You'd see them sashaying along. Their berets on their heads and their clothes made them look nothing like Boers. This is how they walked.
But conditions in the camps were appalling. Disease was rife. All save the poorest blacks had to pay for their food. The only way to earn money was to work for the British, a form of forced labour. If you didn't have a man in your family working for the army, you were charged double for rations.
This was a hard war. Our grannies used to gather locusts for us to eat. Not the big kind you have today, but little ones. They dug up worms for us to chew. We used to eat those worms and also roots from the ground just to survive. The war was heavy going. It was so tough. All we could do was live from day to day.
If the inmates wanted shelter from South Africa's extreme climate, the British weren't about to provide it. The superintendent of Brantford camp was given strict orders.
Tents allotted to you are only for white camps. On no account must these be given to natives.
The blacks lived as third-class citizens, and that's how they died.
It was bad in those days. We didn't all get out of the camp alive. A lot of people died. The old women couldn't take it. They were dropping like flies, dead.
The Reverend W.H.R. Brown was one of very few to visit a black camp.
They have lost everything. And there being no political party interested in their destiny, they go to the wall, as the weakest are bound to.
The Boers still fighting for independence called themselves bitter enders. But the tougher the struggle became, and the likelier British victory looked, the more Boers changed sides. By the final months, a quarter of all Boers in the field were joiners, fighting for the British.
My
father was not nearly as opposed to the English as he was to the joiners. He simply could not stand them. He felt that what they had done was just unforgivable, to betray your nation and your country and your people.
A unit of the 600-strong Farmers' Guard at Bloemfontein. They sided with the British to protect their farms against their fellow Boers. Hence their motto, "What we have we hold," inscribed in bullets over the British crown. Joiners helped the British track down Boers and burn their farms. There were reports of Boers castrating joiners they managed to capture. There were joiners in the camps, put there for their own protection, often in positions of petty authority.
The joiners
treated the people in the camps much worse than the English did. They thought they were the bee's knees. They mocked them. Your husbands are fighting, you're dying of hunger, and we've got piles of food.
Many of the camps were run by renegade Boers. And you get the small, miserable interaction between people who are too close together and have no love. And I think this is what happens, and this is why in South Africa, in that war, one had the elements of a civil war.
The Boers' troubles were mounting. They had relied on the British to house their families in the white concentration camps, awful as they were. By 1902, following the visit and report of the Fawcett Commission, death rates fell and conditions improved, as Boer General Louis Botha confirmed.
One is only too thankful nowadays to know that our wives are under English protection.
But Lord Kitchener decided to leave the Boer women and children on the veldt. Let their menfolk look after them. But the veldt was now a very dangerous place. White women, black women, all were vulnerable. Moruti Setiloane recalls a story told him by an eyewitness.
There came this troop of English soldiers on horseback. And there was this woman there who was gathering cow dung, dry cow dung, to go and make fire. And as they came on, there she was, obviously, naturally, like soldiers, like men who had been away from home. They were sex-starved. They came and they pushed her off and they raped her. And he tells about how she lay there, and one would go into her and go over, and another one would come into her and go over. And every time when somebody, as she lay with her arms open like that, they would take a note with a queen's head and put it on her hand. That is the fairness of the British. You've got to pay for what you get.
My father and others, they would assault these, sexually assault these Boer girls. And you see, the point was this. It's not easy to always find a white woman around anywhere. Where I grew up on the farm, a woman was sacrosanct, a white one was sacrosanct. Here was an open sesame situation, where you can take these girls and they can't refuse, they can't defend themselves. And very often things like that did in fact take place.
European propaganda blamed the British for giving blacks power over white women. The Boers had their own response.
My ma's stiefbroer.
My mother's stepbrother planted them in holes. When they caught a Hottentot molesting women on the farms, they would plant him like a pole in the ground, alive. They planted them so deep that they couldn't get out.
Some Boers now feared that the blacks were threatening the established racial order in South Africa. A lookout point known as Grenadier Hill in the Northern Cape. The soldiers whiled away the time by carving their names. Next to the Tommies are the names of their 3 black comrades in arms, Ali, Sixpence and John. The Boer War had given the blacks an enhanced status alongside Englishmen, and a taste of power over the Boers.
My father had a uniform and a gun, and he had the protection of the English, and wherever the English were, and my father was there, and when the attack against the Boers, he saw the Boers run away, saw the Boers run away. The Boers were frightened of the soldiers, the khakis. It was a bit of sensational pleasure to see them run away.
It seemed to the Cape politician, John X. Merriman, that the genie was out of the bottle.
These people will have been armed and set on to fight and harry white men. It will be difficult to get the arms from them and to teach them to unlearn the lesson.
The Boers, in thinking about the post-war order, clearly saw the end approaching. They could hardly move for the maze of British blockhouses and barbed wire. They could scarcely find food in a land devastated by the British. The Boers were outgunned and outnumbered.
My ma het die Engelse commando's gesien.
My mother saw these overwhelming hordes of English soldiers. She often told us that when they marched towards the Boers, it looked as if the earth was trembling.
En as van die Engelse soldate geval het,
and when an English soldier fell dead in battle, the others simply climbed over him and kept on coming and coming. It was really a hopeless task for the Boers to carry on fighting, for the Boers even to think of winning the war.
Om die oorlog te dink om die oorlog te wen.
The 11th of April 1902, Boer Commandant Potgieter lay dead on the veldt after the last formal battle of the Boer War. Hostilities seemed to fizzle out, and the Boers agreed to peace talks. The Boer delegates met on the 15th of May, south of Pretoria, at Vereeniging. The more they talked, the clearer the calamity became. Men spoke of a dire lack of food and horses, of the treachery of joiners, and of their families' plight on the veldt. They'd always believed God would never let them be defeated.
Die wil van God was vir die burgers baie belangrik geweest. En wanneer die
The will of God was very important to the burghers. And when the talks were held at Vereeniging, some people said, what if God is not on our side? Or what if God wants us to lay down our weapons and submit to the inevitable, to the fact that we have lost our independence? What if God is not with us?
Peace negotiations with the British took place in this pavilion. The Boers were offered guarantees of personal freedom and property rights. The right to use their language in school and courtroom. A £3 million compensation fund for farmers, and the promise of future political autonomy. But would there be any extension of rights to the blacks, as suggested a year before by Colonial Secretary Joseph Chamberlain?
We cannot consent to purchase a shameful peace by leaving the coloured population in the position in which they stood before the war.
But now the priority was to reconcile British and Boer interests. Earlier advice of Lord Milner pointed the way forward.
You only have to sacrifice the nigger absolutely, and the game is easy.
Britain ensured white dominance and black subjugation, by leaving it to the Boers to decide whether to give voting rights to the blacks, thus condemning them to nearly a century of exclusion and oppression.
When the peace treaty was being negotiated at Franklin, my people were not there. The black people were not there. Not only were the blacks not there, but even the interests of blacks were not taken in. And we were easy to be got rid of.
Some black peoples, like the Bachatla in the Western Transvaal, had seen the war as a chance to regain land the Boers took from them long before, to settle old scores. The Bachatla had fought valiantly on the British side. They believed that, come victory, their loyalty would be rewarded.
We hoped the talks would lead to us getting our land back, but we were not allowed to take part in the discussions. They didn't keep us in the picture. We were just ignored. We had fought in the war to recover our land. If we didn't get that, what was the point of us fighting? But then the whites buried the hatchet and closed ranks against us. They became like brothers, dividing our land between themselves, and we were left with nothing.
On the 31st of May 1902, the Boers signed the surrender terms ensuring their eventual supremacy in South Africa. But at the time, they felt their world had caved in.
My father was in torment. They say that that morning he got onto his horse and rode around like a man possessed. The thought of peace terrified him, and he did not know how to deal with it. And when General Smuts returned to his men and said it was peace, there was great animosity, because the people did not want peace. They said the only thing that should come between a man and his freedom is death.
Manie Maritz's men were actually photographed surrendering. But Maritz was far away. He and others had chosen exile rather than life under British rule. The Boers now had to go through the humiliating formalities, signing the oath of allegiance to the crown, giving up their weapons.
My pa was baie ongelukkig, want hulle moes hulle gewere gaan inhandig op vereniging.
My father was very unhappy at having to hand over his guns at Vereniging. It was very difficult for him to bid farewell to his gun, because it had been his friend for 3 long years. 3 difficult, bitterly difficult years. There was one gun Daddy did not give up, his Mauser rifle. That one he kept. He just handed in his Lee Metford.
My pa was maar ongelukkig in hulle hart, want ek meen hulle
My father was heartbroken that the Boers had lost.
hulle land verloor. Hulle het alles verloor.
They lost their country, they lost everything. Many lost their wives and children, so they were bitter and very unhappy. But under the circumstances, they could not carry on anymore.
De Wet and other Boer leaders went around the white camps, explaining the peace deal to the inmates. Some women had wanted the war to continue, saying, "I can get a new husband, but I can't get a new Transvaal." But others asked, "What is the independence of my country to me when my man is dead?" And then, the leaving of the camps, as Christina Ninabo remembers.
Toe die dag kom, sê, die oorlog is op.
The day came and they told us, the war is over.
Julle moet klaarmaak om op die wa klim.
Get your things together, we'll drop you in Johannesburg.
Ons gaan julle aflaai in Johannesburg.
Everyone got on the wagons.
Almal op die waans,
Some women were weeping, some laughing, and some singing.
lachend tuis.
Singing for the dead children they were leaving behind.
Wat dood is, wat agterbly.
The British had incarcerated Boer prisoners of war on the island of St. Helena and in Ceylon and Bermuda. Now these men came home and went in search of their families.
Jy weet, daar van hulle ingekom het, hulle ingekom het.
Some men arrived at the camps only to find no one in their family alive.
Daar's niks, daar's nie kind.
No child, no wife, nobody.
Dan sal hulle nou toe die vrede sluit. Daar's niemand. Nou wie toe moet hulle kom? Dan staan nie.
The man would stand there with his hat on his head and his horse at his arm, and he'd ask, where are they?
Dan soek hy hulle.
And the reply would come,
Hulle lê daar so by kerkhof.
they're over there in the cemetery.
Recognizing your own father could be a problem.
Hy het teruggekom het. Ek weet nie.
My father came home. I was small and silly.
Was klein as nog dom.
My father sat there, and my mother said, say hello to your father.
Ek sê nee.
I said, that's not my father. My father doesn't have hair around his face. That's a baboon.
Hy's 'n bobbejaan.
The group of women on the station embraced their husbands and cried, and it was a terrible scene. But my grandmother was a tiger of a woman, and she said to my grandfather, Gideon, don't just stand there blubbing. There's work to be done on the farm.
Daar was niks.
There was nothing.
Niks op daai plaas.
Nothing on the farms.
Die mielies,
The corn was burnt.
aan die
The
brand.
grain fields were burnt.
Die koringlande is aan.
Wheat had been emptied from
Die
sacks
graan
and
is so
trampled
uitgegooi,
by
die
horses.
sakke uit en die perde en goed het oor het gaan.
The joiners profited little from collaboration. Many returned to ruined farms and the undying hatred of their Boer neighbours.
Wat alles van hulle was ook maar verwoes.
Everything they owned was destroyed.
Alles is verwoes. As jy my land aan die brand steek,
If you set fire to my fields, the wind will blow the flames across to theirs. They thought they'd get cakes and ale, but they only got thorns.
The British Tommy had secured South Africa and her mineral wealth for the Empire. Now he too was going home. A demob parade in Preston, a scene repeated across Britain. Mary Liverseed remembers that day.
When the soldiers came home, we went to see them return. They were in this dull khaki, and they marched round the town hall, and then they stood, and the bonfire was lit, and they watched the bonfire. And looking back, I can picture them now, and I think they looked embarrassed more than happy to be home. Quite embarrassed, standing with this bonfire as their reward for coming back.
The war had different endings for each of the participants. Britain and her colonies left over 22,000 behind in South Africa, buried in cemeteries and on the veldt. Over 100,000 dead and wounded. As Rudyard Kipling wrote, "We have had no end of a lesson. It will do us no end of good." The Boer War established a pattern of empire solidarity, which would include South Africa, repeated in conflicts down the century. It gave more than a taste of wars to come, against freedom-fighting guerrillas and against civilians, colonial strife and total war. Battles like Spion Kop were curtain raisers for the slaughter on the Somme. In time, the Boer War receded from Britain's memory, eclipsed by 2 world wars. It had ushered in the modern age, but no longer seemed part of it. The Imperial Light Horse Memorial bears a fitting epitaph. Tell England, ye who pass this monument, we who died serving her, rest here content. But the blacks were not content. Most had to give their guns back to the British and land back to the Boers. They faced poverty and famine. By the end of the war, there were more blacks fighting than Boers, but they got almost no compensation and even less recognition. They had defended Mafeking with their lives, but Baden-Powell fibbed to the Royal Commission on the War, saying they had run away at the first shots. A memorial was put up to Mafeking's gallant white defenders. The blacks were a grudging afterthought.
Uit dieptes gans verloren.
But the Boers had their own agenda, to set themselves apart from and above all other peoples in South Africa. The white concentration camps would play a key role in that process. Orange River Station Camp is one of the very few untouched since the inmates left a century ago.
Diep van donker nachte roep ek, o Heere,
26,000 Boer women and children, 10% of their population, perished in the camps from disease and neglect. The experience scarred the survivors and their families for life.
Maar dit is soveel.
There was so much sadness in those songs.
Droefheid wat uit daardie gesang.
It has stayed with me my whole life.
Kom met laat dit vir my hele lewe lank bygebly.
I cannot forget it.
Ek kan dit nie vergeet nie.
Uit dieptes gans verlore, van redding ver vandaan.
Maar by die tweede vers, eers by die tweede derde.
At the second verse, my grandma would start singing with her tiny, squeaky little voice. It was like a bat floating above my grandpa's baritone. And at the third line, the dog would start howling along with them. That became a tradition in our home. I asked my father, why are Grandpa and Grandma so sad? My father told me it was because of the concentration camps. Grandpa and Grandma never, ever got over it. Their twin girls who died and the other little children, Grandpa never recovered.
But private grief and bitter personal memories like these were exploited to underpin white supremacy. The first moves had come in 1913, when the Boers, by now self-governing, met at Bloemfontein to honour those who died in the white concentration camps.
The suffering and deaths of the women and children in the concentration camps was an important cornerstone in the establishment of Afrikaner nationalism in the 20th century. The white concentration camps were elevated to the only concentration camps in existence to represent the suffering and to unite the Afrikaner people.
The argument went, we are a people purified by adversity. We alone have suffered like this. We alone are fit to rule in South Africa. History that didn't fit was obliterated. Even the black maids who accompanied their Boer mistresses into the white camps were quickly forgotten. The camps were built over with sombre memorials to the white dead. The black servants who died there were buried some distance away in unmarked graves. As for the black concentration camps, over the years their very existence was expunged from South Africa's history.
The white concentration camps became everything, and yet the suffering in the black concentration camps was as bad.
A century of silence and cover-up has made the black camps very hard to find today. An old map shows one in the Free State, near Alleman's Siding. There is no record of the camp's exact location, but there are graves on a nearby hillside. Not one or two, but many. Hermanus Pitsu, the black farm worker who found the graves, shows them to local historian Johan Lok. They are watched by the owner of the land, Andre Hayes. Her family wasn't here during the Boer War, and she had no idea there were graves on her farm.
Je moet hom meet hoor. Dink jy moet hom meet. Bang as jy hom meet. Net gelees. Ja, dit is hierdie graf, is 'n kind se graf. Ja, dit is 'n kind se graf. Ja, is die groot mens daar. Ja. Okay, tel hom op. Loop ons ter aan hierso.
Some of these graves contain more than one body. Current estimates put black deaths in the camps at 18,000. But new discoveries are pushing the figures upwards. It's possible that as many people died in the black concentration camps as in the white.
Ek en nou Hermanus het nou hier rondgeloop by die begrafplaas. Ja. Om te kyk wat ons kry. En ons het ook die grafte getel hierso.
Ja. Hoeveel is daar?
638 grafte.
Ja, ek kan dit nie glo nie, dis onmoontlik.
Baie grafte. Ons dink dit is die grafte van 'n Britse konsentrasiekamp vir swart mense.
My pa self het nie geweet dat hier 'n kamp was nie.
Hoe het jy geweet dis grafte die van die Boereoorlog?
Nee, daar was 'n man wat hier gebly, die dieselfde plek wat die mense gesê het, gepraat met hom, maar ek het hulle gesien, maar toe vra ek hom, wat se grafnis is baie daarso. Sy sê nee, dis oorlogse mense se grafnis. Ja, die oorlogse mense.
Maar julle weet nie heeltemal waar die kamp nou was hier by die Allemanstasie nie.
Nee, ons het nog nie die kamp gekry nie. Ek en Hermanus het natuurlik gesoek vir hierdie kamp. Hermanus sê vir my dat 'n begrafplaas so baie naby 'n kamp gewees het. Dit is 'n taak vir die toekoms, ons gaan hom kry.
Ja, ek wonder.
Die quarry geloop het.
Ja, dalk so intoe waar die lande is.
Ja.
Dan ons gaan hom kry, Hermanus het my gesê hy soek vir die kamp en ook sy manne soek vir die kamp. Hulle soek vir asoop, hulle soek vir klippe.
Nou verskriklik moet gesels.
Dan kan die baie loop soekplaas of wat. Ja, kan jy dit plek kry.
The Boer War has cast a long shadow across the century. Only since black majority rule can its lost history, shared by blacks and whites, be recovered.